Facial recognition, the other side of what we own and what we don't own. And by the way,
Mhm.
I kind of laugh when I hear people say, like, well, they don't think they're in a facial recognition database. If you have flown and you've gone to the airport through TSA and you stood in front of a camera and handed them your ID and they scanned your ID, guess what? You're in the database, folks. There's
100%.
a facial map of you, a facial signature in the US government database. And anytime there's a significant crime, they're comparing your picture to the suspect. Mark, right now, 25% or more of the 18,000 law enforcement agencies in the US use some kind of facial recognition. And I guess basically what is it? It's the input of a photo or even video, right?
Mhm.
A computer creates a facial map or facial signature of that person, and then it's stored in a database and it's compared against driver's license photos, booking photos. Like I said, TSA photos now, right? TSA
Mhm.
has a huge database. But also, there are independent companies out there that scour social media and rip pictures of people, right? When I say rip, I just mean collect, grab pictures of people with identifying information, package them up, and sell them so that you may be identified from a picture you put on social media a couple years ago. It's
Yeah.
possible that could, cause a hit or whatever. Um, in 2020, Florida, Mark, was doing 8,000 facial recognition searches a month. So that's 4 years ago. I got to think it's gone up quite a bit since then. And at that time, they had 11 million mugshots, 22 million driver's license photos in their database, and that doesn't even discuss what's out there from social media. Tell me what your thoughts are on facial recognition, and is it something that it's like, hey, if you're out in public, you have no expectation of privacy? And here's the thing about it. We can talk about this more in a minute, but it's not perfect. It's not
No.
100% perfect. I've seen a iPhone that belonged to, let's say, a 60-year-old man. His daughter, who was 30-ish,
Mhm.
her facial signature would unlock that iPhone.
Yeah.
And
No,
how
it's
would that
funny
happen?
because
I'm sorry, Mark, but I don't
no.
know how. I guess an algorithm or the structure or the relationship of different points on the face, even though they looked a little similar, but scientifically or mathematically, there was enough of a similarity that it unlocked the phone.
Yeah. I have an article here. It's a few years old. It's August 2021, so 2.5 years, by not Nigel Jones, co-founder of the Privacy Compliance Hub. From what I can read, this is from Great Britain, but this goes exactly to what you were just addressing. In South Wales, police testing a facial recognition system saw 91% of matches labeled as false positives, as the system made 2,451 incorrect identifications and only 234 correct ones when matching a face to a name on the watch list. Similarly, in New York City, the transit authority halted a pilot that had a 100% error rate. Facial recognition tools work a lot better than in the lab they do in the real world. Small factors such as light, shade, and how the image is captured
Mhm.
affect the result. Now, again, this is 2.5 years ago. I would imagine technology is better. However, the implications of even a 50 or 25% inaccuracy rate, false positive, is enormous when you're talking about the lives of individual people. Your question, Bill, about do we have a right to our image? Do we have a right to privacy when we're walking on the sidewalk in New York City? Actually, the question is, do we have a right to life and liberty in New York City? That's
Yeah.
the first question right now, but it's probably a bad example. But the question is as former law enforcement officials, we know that when people are outside, if they're driving down the street, the highway, there is no inherent right to privacy once you put yourself in a public setting. There are numerous exceptions to that, but generally, when you put yourself in a public setting, there's no implied right to right to privacy. And the question is, now that we all know when you are walking down the street, certainly in a downtown area of any city, you know that if you're out for an hour, you've probably been captured on 200 cameras. I mean,
Hmm.
let's clear about this. This is the way it is now. Security cameras, surveillance cameras, um, your image, your movements are captured. Question is what happens? What is done with those images? Again, if you go back 50 years and you're at Disneyland and some person across the way in front of the Magic Castle takes a picture and you happen to be in that picture, you don't even know the person. In other words, there is no violation of that person's part of your rights. You're in
Hmm.
a public setting, maybe you're in private property, but you're in a public setting and you're captured now on a Polaroid that's going to be up over their mantle for the rest of the century or whatever it is. Is that a violation of your rights? No. So there's no difference between that and I think in a security camera. The question is now everything's recorded. And unlike that Polaroid 50 years ago, now that information can be disseminated to endless sources from the person who actually captured it. That's the question. And again, we talked about this a minute ago about the courts being sluggish, things like this, and technology changing so quickly. It is how and why is that information disseminated, and do you have any recourse at that point? Certainly, we can talk about commercial use and things like that. If someone's image is used to make money, that's a whole different story. But how it's used to actually manipulate your own life, and that's so deep in the weeds. It's so complicated. I certainly don't have the answer. But again, we know it's happening, and it's a very daunting situation. There's one more point. I want to let you respond to that if you like to. But there's another point, a couple points in this article I want to touch on that we've actually just scraped the surface of a minute ago. But go ahead.
No, no, I was just going to say, so Mark, when does it become a search? If you're
Right.
walking down the street, and I get it, it is, you're out in public. So just as someone can walk by you and look at your face, there's a camera on a pole that could take a picture of you. When does that become a search? Is it then, should we be looking at what's done with the photo after it's captured? If it's run through a facial recognition database, is that something that should require a warrant to try to match that photo against another one? Or is it just, hey, this is the future where technology is going to be used? And I can talk about a couple cases in a few minutes
Hmm.
where things kind of got off the rails because this technology was relied on too much. But I guess my question mark is to you, when does it become a search? We could
Well, I
not
think
look in
it.
that person's we couldn't look in their pockets as they're
Right.
walking down the streets, but because we can see their face, is it fair game?
Yeah, it's a very difficult question. I don't pretend to have the answer, but I will say this. It certainly goes down that road of a surge when law enforcement now seeks out specific data from a private entity because they're looking for a particular person or particular people or a particular vehicle. And I think that opens up the entire discussion about search and seizure is what is the government? Because again, the Fourth Amendment, the 14th Amendment, they do not apply to private citizens, period. They do not apply to private citizens. It only applies to government officials, to law enforcement, for sake of this conversation. And so, or an agent of the government. So that's the question. And how broad, how broad can it be before it's not a search and seizure? Or how narrow does it have to become before it becomes search? And again, this is for people hopefully to hash out that have a higher level of legal training, of constitutional training than I do. But that's where it is. In other words, if a company is knowingly providing information that they have obtained legally through surveillance, their own property, things like this, to law enforcement. See, in my opinion, for search purposes,
Mhm.
for investigative purposes, to me, that is now becoming an agent of the government, in my humble
Mhm.
opinion. That's what I feel. And I think there's plenty of room for argument in a courtroom about whether or not that search, that perusal of video of camera footage is legal if the government, if law enforcement agency is specifically using it to search, to investigate a crime. That's where I fall on that. Again, but these are very nuanced discussions and illegal
Uh,
discussions.